Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, the show that keeps it real, then takes it the next step. Stacy.
Right, Max. Well, I'm going to take it the next step, and perhaps a step too far, with a metaphor for what is happening around the world in terms of the global monetary system overseen by the nanny that is the central banks. We saw this week that the ECB has announced yet another 500 billion euros of quantitative easing. And this headline here gives me a metaphor for what these central banks are. Basically, the central banks are a giant nappy, as they say in the United Kingdom. In the United States, we say diaper. COVID, China asked cabin crew to wear nappies to reduce virus risk. This is supposed to help them avoid the toilets on the plane, and so they don't get COVID or whatever. But I feel like, the Fed is the diaper. It holds all the toxic waste inside it. And that was meant to prevent a spread of a pandemic of bad financial debts.
It's meant to spread inflation, right? So a leaky diaper, which nobody likes, a leaky diaper. No. I wouldn't want to be on an Air China flight and have one of the stewards with a leaky diaper. Yeah. It would turn me off for whatever was on the menu at that particular time, and I'd feel like I had overpaid for that particular ticket. But the Fed is essentially accumulating all of the toxic debts. Why are they doing that? They're doing it for two reasons. To prevent these banks like JP Morgan and others from having to declare insolvency, even though they are insolvent. And they also do it to stop the spread of inflation, because they are neutralizing the impact of all that money printing by putting it right back on the Fed's balance sheet. It's called debt monetization. And America used to make fun of the so-called banana republics in Latin America for doing debt monetization. But they've out-bananaed all the banana republics in one big banana split that no diaper can possibly hold back.
Right. The nanny, the central bank at this point, has always said, back to Ben Bernanke was saying that they could always stop this, right? They could change the diaper and it would be fine. The economy would return to normal. But they have not changed the diaper. The diaper, if you've ever taken care of a baby, you have to change that diaper pretty frequently. Otherwise, it gets pretty messy. And that could be what we're seeing coming up soon, because this headline from, I believe it's Bloomberg, brace yourself for a sharp rise in inflation. Avoiding longer dated government and corporate debt and keeping to the very short end seems sensible. Classical economics largely assumes that all things being equal, increasing the supply of money pushes inflation higher. And yet, after years of rate cutting, quantitative easing, and so forth, the only thing that has gone up is asset prices. It has been Apple Inc., as it were, not apples. The author points out that there's been no velocity of money. It's collapsed. And that has caused, the nanny of the central bank is confused about what to feed this child that is the financial system, the banking system that they regulate, what to feed it to get it to, have normal movement again.
Right. Well, we've been saying this for a number of years. So the quantitative easing or debt monetization or money printing preceded by central bank by taking that money back, right, has its limitations, because planet Earth has a certain debt saturation level, right? And we went to almost $100 trillion now in, the GDP of the world is about just under $100 trillion. And the debt to GDP for planet Earth is getting close to 300% of GDP. And so you have a certain situation where they get debt saturation and the ability for central banks. And remember, the Federal Reserve has bought back many trillions of dollars worth of toxic assets. The ECB has bought back, and Bank of Japan is the king of it all, Bank of England. So they've bought back in aggregate probably, my guess is, close to $50 trillion worth of toxic assets. And at some point, just the physics of it don't work anymore. So that means that every dollar printed going forward, because it can't be absorbed by the account chicanery and fraudulent accounting of quantitative easing, goes into something called the CPI, Consumer Price Index. And the value of that money printing will now debase the currency for real. And this is going to be the end game, as it were, because once the, quote, inflation genie is out of the bottle, you can't put it back into the bottle, because the central banks are caught in a trap where, to try to stave off financial ruination and insurgency and insurrection, they will open the money taps even more, and that will cause like a Weimar Republic type hyperinflation. And we've already seen this with Bitcoin, of course, because the US dollar is in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin now for 10 years. So Bitcoin is telling us that the US dollar, the true purchasing power of the US dollar, is close to that of a full and pungent diaper.
Speaking of full and pungent diapers, let's look at that velocity of money and how it might cause inflation. Because if the Fed is the central bank of central banks, okay, there's the BIS, but they don't print money like the US Federal Reserve does. And they oversee their collection of big baby bankers. And Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan are the biggest, right? They're the big giant baby in the corner screaming the loudest. So their diaper is fullest of all. As soon as, like, somebody has to change that diaper one day. And when you change that diaper, all of that inflation comes flooding out. And that's what this opinion writer in the Bloomberg article is pointing out, is that part of what's happening is that China is booming right now. Their economy is booming and their exports are booming. So we're actually starting to see genuine inflation that you can't hide in Jamie Dimon's diaper. Prices are now rising strongly, in part because Asian growth is humming. Chinese export prices have risen year over year, excluding oil. Industrial commodity prices are also now higher than they were at the end of last year. Even if nothing moves between now and late spring of 2021, year over year comparisons will start to look pretty dramatic as prices this spring were at their low point. These trends are already making themselves felt in the developed world. U.S. import prices, for example, are rising strongly. Durable goods prices are on a tear. There are signs that services inflation is also rising.
This is part of what you call we're talking about the Thucydides trap. This is passing the baton from America to China, who will become dominant in the 21st century. So the dollar will collapse, fiat money will collapse, but of all the fiat money collapsing, the Chinese yuan will collapse the least. And the Chinese middle class, because their yuan will be collapsing much less than the US dollar, their purchasing power will go up to keep up with the rising commodity cost. So yeah, prices will go up, but their purchasing power of the yuan will also go up, and wages will go up as this transition to China takes place. So the US, their purchasing power will fall dramatically. Prices will go up sharply. Social unrest, which is already at a tinderbox moment, will explode in unfathomably violent protests. And but it all could have been prevented at any time of the previous 20 years by the central bank, who decided, starting with Alan Greenspan with the Greenspan put, there was no market sell-off ever since 1987 that the central bank didn't decide they needed to bail out Warren Buffett and the folks on Wall Street. Had they not bailed those guys out even once over the past 25 years, America would not be losing its empire and handing it over to China. Keep that in mind. Don't blame me. Blame Alan Greenspan.
To keep with this metaphor that we're using, had they just changed their diaper of the banking system at least once, and now instead we have this a horrible situation. There's no way to address the fact that you haven't changed the baby's diaper in 4 days. It's going to be, no matter what, it's going to be a gruesome situation when you go in there to change it. So, and nobody's happy. Like, the baby's crying, you're stressed out, the central bankers are stressed out, and you start to make bad decisions. Like this, just to put things into perspective, volume of negative yielding debt has topped $18 trillion for the first time ever after ECB promised to keep printing press rumbling for longer than expected. As I'm saying, this is the central bank saying, I'm not going to change your diaper yet again today, Jamie Dimon.
Right. That's the central banks making the diaper bigger.
Yeah.
Right. And negative interest rates are simply an invention of a central bank to stop the natural flow of the economy and nature and humanity. They're trying to stick their finger in the dike of this tsunami of paper money. And as that article says, he says he's tightening up on the yield curve. He's going short paper. He's getting rid of all of his medium to long-term bonds. Because this will show up in two major ways. Number one will be prices for stuff will start to go up precipitously, and it'll cause enormous problems. But the bond market now, after 25 years of being artificially kept on that diaper, once you, like a piñata, if you were to rip that diaper open and the explosive diarrhea of money printing spews in a tsunami of fecal matter all over America's faces, they're going to be feeling less excited about the previous 20 years.
The guy does mention the 1994 bond massacre that everybody in the markets seems to have forgotten now. That, he says, could be something that happens. And
yeah, 1994 was a huge bond massacre, and mostly in the professional classes. So it wasn't like the stock market crash or the dot-com crash or the subprime crash. The 94 bond market crash, I remember I was living in Europe at the time, and it made me thankful that I had been semi-retired from Wall Street, because there was a lot of blood on the streets at that time. But once, bond market crashes are catastrophic, and this one could be the mother of all bond market crashes. And that means that interest rates suddenly spike up. So here you have 1 billion empty hotel rooms in America this in 2020, and all the hotel operators can't make their payments. Now increase interest rates by 500 basis points or 600 basis points or 700 basis points. Now you've got 2 billion empty hotel rooms in America. Your unemployment rate is now at 25, 30, 35%. And the value of purchasing power of your dollar just crashed against every other currency in the world, in particular against Bitcoin. And it's whoever's in the White House, they're going to have a really challenging time.
well, the problem with this is that our global financial system is run by the same nanny that has let this diaper situation get out of control. Right. So the dollar is the global financial grid, and it's like Russia and China have weaned themselves off it, but other nations haven't. And that it's going to cause, if it causes that sort of situation here, like the 94 bond market massacre spilled over within the next 3 years to the Asian financial crisis and stuff like that. So there are knock-on effects that will last if this happens for a few years afterward that we don't know yet. But of course, Keiser Report will be there reporting on it.
Right. Well, the number one effect will be a transition of power to China from the U.S. The Thucydides trap was coming in the next 18 months, and it'll be finished. We're going to take a break and use the bathroom. But when we come back, we'll be freshened up and ready for a scintillating part 2. So don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Dan Collins. He is an entrepreneur. He lived in China for 20 years. Now he's back in America. Dan, welcome back.
Hey, Max, good to be back.
We've talked to you over many years, and you gave us an insider's perspective in what's going on in China for many years, and a lot of what you said really has played out in real time. Now, you warned our audience 18 months ago, long before Joe Biden was even the nominee, that Hunter Biden had issues in China. Now the Department of Justice is investigating him for tax evasion and money laundering. What do we know about his business dealings in China, Dan?
It's been out there a while. The Intercept has reported on this. He basically got a $1.5 billion loan from the People's Bank of China, which just doesn't happen. No, as a foreigner, you're not even allowed to have a private asset management company in China. Somehow he gets it. And he's not the only one. There's several high-profile politicians that have made hundreds of millions of dollars this way out of China. But Hunter, yeah, $1.8 billion. They then use that money. They're given special access to some Chinese IPOs, and then the money comes back over here in a joint venture with AVIC, which is like the Lockheed Martin of China, and they start buying up companies that have dual-use military technology. There's one in Michigan. But the Bidens were basically political cover for all this so that the Chinese military could go buy up companies. Yeah, it's been out there. It's all reported out on the Intercept. And it's all the information has recently come out with leaked audio, and they were basically being run by the master spy chief of China.
Now, during the vice presidential debates recently, Chinese censors cut away from Pence when he answered the China question, and then back to Kamala Harris when she was asked these questions. China obviously prefers Biden to Trump, but how do you expect this relationship to change, especially in light of the revelations that a Democratic member of Congress may have been in sleeping with a Chinese spy?
Well, if there's any young, enterprising journalists out there, if you start to look into this story, the layers and intricacies, it's massive. So we could end up with a whole new McCarthy-style trial of politicians that have access to Chinese money. It just, the list goes on and on. The Chinese have been, they're trying to infiltrate the U.S. the same way they would infiltrate themselves, which is going right to the top of the political networks and basically doing business with them to bribe them. So it's not surprising if you understand how the Chinese system works. It's very easy to lay out, and it's not just one side of the aisle; it's also the other side. To take a look at the McConnells and the tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in Chinese shipping contracts. So it's really the elephant in the room of American politics now, and now it's just a question of, are we going to see any action taking place on it?
I think it's pretty clear at this point that America's become a vassal state of China. I'm 99% certain of this, and I think anyone who argues that point is a moron. Now, let's talk about this. There's a new Bretton Woods. What do you think China will demand when they all get together for this?
As you're well aware, Max, the currency system's under complete pressure now. The fiat system's under complete pressure. The world's been printing money for decades and decades. It's now spun completely out of control. You've got money supplies, that have increased 30, 40% year over year. We're really starting to see the final supernova explosion of the fiat system. We're going to go to a new Bretton Woods. People, there's a lot of people that are talking about global SDRs or global currencies, but you can't even get the European Union to agree to a common currency. So, or policies towards that, towards their monetary system. So I highly doubt we're going to see further global coordination on monetary system in Bretton Woods. If you do see anything, China's going to take, they've been taking larger and larger shares of global institutions, voting rights, these types of things. So I think we're going to see a fray. We're going to see, we're going to see a fiat quickly having bigger and bigger problems. You see it outside the USD bubble. We've had a 10-year basic collapse in most global currencies, whether it's from Argentina to Turkey, basically USD, EU, Japan, and RMB. That core has held up, but now even that's starting to fray. I don't know if a new Bretton Woods can save the fiat system, so we'll see what happens.
To be clear, as you point out, there is a common currency in the EU, but the member states are always fighting. Great Britain is leaving, so this is not a coherent policy at all. Now, let's talk about Pearl Harbor for a second. We had the annual anniversary of Pearl Harbor, of course, brought America into World War II. And at the other end of World War II, America was the only major economy standing, and it gave us the American century and all that kind of stuff. But now COVID has kind of like been the equivalent of World War II, and there's only one big economy standing post-COVID, and that would be China. So tell us about the recovery in China. What are the most remarkable stats coming out of China right now?
I've actually been recently looking over this over the whole year, and it's quite interesting. If you go back to January and February, major publications like The Economist were talking about the Wuhan crisis, the Wuhan flu. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. They weren't contemplating what would happen later if it escaped Wuhan and escaped China. They were even saying, pray for Wuhan. Wuhan's on your Facebook. 17 people are dead. Okay, even we had no idea what was coming for us back in January and February, obviously. But what's interesting is by March, China's basically back to work. So from March, they've been months and months and months without transmissible cases. They basically quickly went into action. They started contact tracing. They did a very draconian lockdown, but they got it under control. And as it went all over the world and done what it has done, as we all have been living through, they've been basically back to work. And we kind of woke up in COVID and realized, wow, we don't make anything here, which we've been talking about on the show for years and years. We don't make antibiotics. We don't make medical supplies. The list will go on and on and on. The manufacturing system in the U.S. has been decimated. It's a service sector economy. China has rebounded because it's a real manufacturing sustainable economy. And over here in the U.S., most of our economy has been turned into service sector, serving each other meals in restaurants, and that's gone. And so we are having a very difficult time now to recover here in the U.S. and Europe.
Plus, in China and in Asia, they had experience with a few of these pandemics, not pandemics, but huge viruses like SARS, for example, and wearing masks and taking precautions had already been a drill that they had learned. And so when this hit, they had a protocol. The U.S. hadn't experienced anything in almost 100 years, so there were no protocols in place. And as you point out, the economy in World War II in America was very entrepreneurial and free market capitalism. But that won't help now because, particularly under Bill Clinton, is when it reached its apex. America basically shipped all their jobs to China for a big fat Clinton Foundation payday. Thank you, Bill and Hillary. And so there's no way to extricate ourselves because the manufacturing capacity to rebuild it would take decades. And there's no money for it because the US dollar is collapsing. But let's talk about some of the particulars. Ant Financial, the initial public offering was pulled. This was very dramatic. Do you have any sense of what's going on there? You know, the Dan Collins inside scoop. That's what we need. What happened with this Ant Financial IPO? It's been compared to J.P. Morgan to provide some comparison to the size of this whole thing. What's really going on, Dan?
Well, yeah, Ant Financial is the world's largest creditor at this point. They are one of the two largest money managers in China now. They were about to do the world's largest IPO, way surpass Saudi Aramco IPO. And the valuation of the company, I think the top officials in China just got nervous at how much power this company has, and they kind of told them who's the boss and pulled it back. Long term, it won't stop Ant Financial IPO. You know, the Ant Financial group spun out of Alibaba, which is one of the world's largest tech companies. And but it's basically the top leadership is just trying to gain control before, you know, they'll probably most likely IPO again next year. So I don't expect any long-term changes that way.
So to follow up on this Ant Financial deal, it's an enormous company. It's as big as J.P. Morgan, the biggest bank in the world. Plus, it spun out of Alibaba, as you point out, Jack Ma's company, which rivals Amazon for global dominance in the retail sector. And it's part and parcel of this emerging model in China, which I guess one could call their surveillance capitalism, where the Alipay, which is a very, phone-enabled pay service, connected to all the credit service, connected to Ant Financial, connected to the CCP, the Chinese government, gives an extraordinary amount of oversight into people's tick-tock, second by second lives. They are literally living in the Chinese Communist Party's living room. Is that a model ultimately that will sweep the globe? And what prevents Ant Financial at one point from simply buying J.P. Morgan or buying Goldman Sachs or buying Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac? I've often said that China would become America's biggest landlord. All they need to do is to buy Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae from the U.S. government that's deeply in dire straits, deeply in debt, right? So what stops this global sea, this global tide from doing exactly that, Dan?
Yeah, nothing is stopping it. In 10 years, Alibaba and Ant Financial will be 5 times bigger than they are now. They're already bigger than J.P. Morgan. They started out from a basis of they kind of call themselves the new technology finance, And what it is they started to say not enough people in China are getting access to loans. So as you know, the e-commerce market China is already by far much larger than the U.S. This year, single day, they did more sales in 24 hours. That represents about a fifth, over $100 billion. That represents about a fifth of U.S. e-commerce annual sales. China did that in 24 hours. A lot of that's all done through the Alibaba Ant Financial, payment system. They do have a view on everything, but they started out to get microcredit out to people, and it quickly became the largest creditor in the world. I mean, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in loans out there. They can authorize your loan in 3 seconds. I mean, they have all your credit history. They have algorithms that know if you're going to pay it back or not, and they have some of the most sophisticated algorithms around that space that even companies in the West are trying to figure out how these guys are doing this.
Right. So in America, to access credit to do a leveraged buyout, if you're, let's say, Mitt Romney over there at Bain Capital, you can get the money in 3 seconds and they charge you 0%. But the rest of America, they go to a payday lender, they're charged 3,000%. So China's saying, well, why don't we just extend the same terms that Bain Capital gets to our citizens and let them elevate the entire country and everyone will get rich. And, the difference being something like here in the U.S., well, I mean, is that an accurate statement?
Well, it's absolutely accurate. As you've mentioned many times, U.S. is in a weird form of interest rate apartheid here. It's like if you're in that system, you get free money, and if you're not, you're going to pay 30% on your credit card. So it's a ridiculous system. So Alibaba, and what Tencent later did as well with their credit programs, is trying to get money out to where the state-owned banking system's failing. It's not reaching those very small entrepreneurs. That's the vacuum that they took up. So, and they did it through technology. So, that's what JP Morgan and these guys in the US should have been doing the last decade. But instead, they're just taking free money and going and buying stuff and manipulating LIBOR and doing all these other things that they've been, busted for.
Right, they're just taking the money for themselves. Exactly. All right, we're going to have to carry this over to the second segment. Dan Collins, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks very much.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our friend Dan Collins. Until next time, bye, y'all.